All right, here's a quick overview of question 5, 6, and 7 from the homework from yesterday from the Ed puzzle. On problem number 5, the first step on every problem, you need a piece of paper. You need to copy the triangle. You need to circle the reference angle. You need to find out which side is the hypotenuse, which side is the adjacent, and which side is the opposite. Once you have your triangle labeled, you can see that we have a number on the opposite side and we have a variable on the hypotenuse. So when we look at SOHCAHTOA, the only trig ratio that includes the opposite and the hypotenuse is sine. So this will be a sine problem. So we start out and we know the opposite over the hypotenuse in every 51-degree right triangle will equal the opposite over the hypotenuse in every other 51-degree right triangle. So in our specific triangle, our opposite is 7 and our hypotenuse is x. So we have the opposite is 7, the hypotenuse is x. On the other side of the proportion, we would normally look at a second triangle and find the length of its opposite side and its hypotenuse. But we don't need to do that because we know that the sine of 51 degrees will equal the same thing as that fraction right there. Also, we know that with our new 2000s calculator that we have, where we can put the equation on the screen, that we don't really even need to copy down the decimal from our calculator. Now, if you have an older 1980s calculator like I did in high school, you won't be able to put the equation on the screen, and you're going to have to write down the decimal. And the decimal would go right here in your equation, where the people with a new modern calculator are writing the sine of 51. Before we go any further, remember your calculator has to have a D on the screen right here. If you don't have a D on the screen, hit Shift, Setup, and choose choice number 3, which tells your calculator that you want to measure in degrees. So here's the beginning of our equation. This is our proportion, and you need to write the proportion on your paper. If you're trying to get the answer without writing this stuff down, this is too hard. There's too many steps, too many things to understand. You have to use paper. So we have the sine of 51 over 1 equals x7 over x. And the first thing that you need to realize, and I think you guys are realizing this, that problems with x on the bottom are more confusing and you're more likely to get them wrong. So if there's an x on the bottom, our equation will include a fraction. Now, we want to find the cross product or cross multiply. And if we did, we'd get sine 51x equals 7. And then we'd have to divide by the sine of 51. So what most people do in math is they switch, and this switch is courtesy of what's called the commutative property of multiplication. If we have the sine of 51 here and the x here, and we want to multiply them, in multiplication, multiplying sine 51 times x is exactly the same thing as multiplying x times the sine of 51. So it doesn't matter if the sine of 51 is on the top and the x is on the bottom, or after we make the switch, the x is on the top and the sine of 51 is on the bottom. And like it says in this red box, x is on the bottom, so our equation will include a fraction. So x was on the bottom here, but after we use the commutative property to make the switch, now we have x over 1, which is just equal to x, equals the fraction that we're talking about in this red box, which is 7 over the sine of 51. So on your calculator, you just need to type this fraction in and hit the equal sign and find out what the decimal answer is. So in order to do that, I'm going to hit the fraction button. I'm going to put a 7 on the top. I'm going to put the sine of 51 on the bottom, close the parentheses, press the equal sign, and it comes out to 9.007. And this 7 right here is big enough to bump up that 0 to a 1. So my final answer is x equals 9.01. On problem number 6, again, you need to get out paper. You need to draw the triangle. You need to circle the reference angle. You need to find the two sides of the reference angle. The longest is the hypotenuse. The other one is the adjacent. And then the leftover side is called the opposite side. In this problem, we have an x on the adjacent side and the number 18 on the opposite side. So we need to pick the trig ratio that includes the opposite and the adjacent. And the only one that includes the opposite and the adjacent is tangent. So we will use tangent on this problem. So we have the opposite over the adjacent in any 58-degree right triangle will equal the opposite over the adjacent in any other 58-degree right triangle. And in our specific right triangle, we have an opposite that's 18 and an adjacent that's x. So instead of looking at a second triangle, we know in trigonometry that in this case, the tangent of 58 will equal the same thing as the opposite over the adjacent in any 58-degree right triangle. And with our new modern calculator, we don't need to worry about writing the decimal down. We just take this proportion right here, and we have tangent 58 over 1 equals 18 over x. And again, on this problem, x is on the bottom, so our equation will include a fraction. And so the shortcut, it's really a mathematically valid thing. The commutative property allows us to skip several steps. Since the tangent of 58 is on the top and we need to multiply it by the x that's on the bottom, tangent 58 times x is the same thing as x times the tangent of 58. So we can switch these two things, and that is because of the commutative property. So we switch the tangent of 58 to the bottom and it looks like this, and we switch the x to the top and it looks like this. So now x over 1 is just equal to x, and on the right side of our equation, we have 18 over the tangent of 58. So we go over to our calculator and we hit the fraction button. On the top of the fraction, we put in 18. On the bottom of the fraction, we put in tangent 58. Close the parenthesis. And we hit the equal sign, and it tells us the answer is 11.247. So this 7 is big enough to bump up the 4, so that is a 5 in our answer. So our answer is x equals 11.25 feet. All right, finally on problem number 7, we circle the reference angle. We label the hypotenuse and the adjacent, and then the remaining side is called the opposite. In this problem, our adjacent side has an x and our hypotenuse has a 662. So we need to find a trig ratio that uses the adjacent side and the hypotenuse, and that is cosine. So our proportion is going to be adjacent over hypotenuse in any 68-degree right triangle is going to equal the adjacent over the hypotenuse in any other 68-degree right triangle. In our specific triangle, our adjacent side is x and our hypotenuse is 662. So now we bring our proportion over here. Here's our x over 662, and we replace the adjacent over the hypotenuse part of this proportion with the cosine of 68 over 1, because the cosine of 68 will equal the adjacent side divided by the hypotenuse in any 68-degree right triangle. Now this problem is a little different. The x is on the top, so our equation will not include a fraction. So if we find the cross product in this problem, instead of multiplying x by the trig function like we did on problem number 5 and 6, we're multiplying the x by 1 because this time the x is on the top. Well, x times 1 is just x. And when we multiply the other way, we get 622 times the cosine of 68. Remember, you always want to write the distance or the length of the side, which is 622, in front of the cosine of the angle. You don't want the 68 degrees getting mixed up with the 662 miles, because you'll tell your calculator either that you have a lot more miles than you do, or you have a lot bigger angle than you do. So you need to write your equation like this. And We're going to type that into our calculator. So this time, all we need to do is write in, we don't need the fraction button. We just put in 662 times the cosine of 68. And when we press the equals button, it's for 247.989. So this 9 right here is big enough to bump up the 8. So our final answer for the length of the adjacent side is that x equals 247.99 miles.